I think accountability is sort of the holy grail of improving ourselves. There's actually a psychological principle called the incorporation effect. When you make change, there's always going to be a reverting back to the norm because you're more comfortable there. And what you have to do is you have to get beyond that place to get to the next level.
Hey, MensGroup community. I'm Sean Galla, founder of MensGroup and host of the MensGroup Podcast, where we interview guys who I would consider male role models. And a great example of that today is Tony Daloisio. Did I say it right?
Daloisio.
I got it wrong. We were just talking about it.
You had it before.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm really excited to have Tony here today because he's has deep experience as a psychologist. He's worked with men. He works with high-level C-suite teams and executives. And he just wrote a book specifically on men and the journey that men face and how to think about, taking on some of the challenges we face and how to shift the game in your favor. Tony, instead of doing you a disservice of trying to fumble my way through summarizing your life, I'd love to hear just a quick summary of what you do for work, because it's so relevant, how you got into that, and most importantly, like what led to you writing this book for men, and then we can get into some specifics.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's good to be with you guys. So, my work has been over the last 20 years working with executives and executive teams, primarily organizations, both Fortune 50s and startups that are going through major change or growth. And they find themselves a bit challenged by, their growth, and leadership becomes the most critical sort of variable in the equation. And so the work I've been doing is in helping them to implement those strategies by helping them to be the best leader they can be. So that's kind of what my day job is. And that's really fun and exciting. And I love doing it. But most of the time, the men, in large part, men who are leading these organizations, not only, but certainly in large part, they often run into themselves and, sort of what their sort of own glass ceiling is that holds them back. Because one of the quotes I love is you can only lead others you cannot lead others at a higher level than you're leading yourself. You can't lead other people at a higher level than you're leading yourself. So the question becomes, how do you lead yourself? And that's really what the Journeyman is about, the book that I wrote. So that's kind of what I do. But the personal aspect of this and the genesis for what I am really talking with you about more so is this book that I decided to write during the pandemic called The Journeyman Life. And it's the not so perfect path to a life well lived. And it's essentially about the journey that men take in their lives, the challenges that we go through, sort of more thematically, and sort of themes that come up in our lives as men. And then I put myself on the couch as an example of sort of how these things come to life. So it's a book. It's not really about me. It's really about the people who are reading it. But I use myself as an example and the insights that I've been working on and learning about over the years. It's been a bit of a passion for me I came from a really challenged background where my mother was in and out of mental institutions. It was a bit like growing up in a concentration camp. She had two boys that died. I was what she called the 3-in-1 boy, wow, which was kind of the only one left. And she basically coveted me so much that sometimes she wouldn't let me out of the house.
Yeah.
It was a pretty tough situation. I grew up really not having a voice, and I'm learning, Sean, that I have a lot of trauma in my body and a lot of challenges. My core beliefs that I've grown up with and done a lot of workarounds around are sort of crutches, and I write about those in the book. And so I'm trying to really draw attention to, because everybody's got their own story. I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that this is normal, and that there are ways that we can sort of move through this, not only in terms of sort of crutches, but also in terms of actually dealing with the root cause.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's what we're trying to do here, is really bring awareness to guys that this stuff inside of us is real. It affects almost every decision we make. And so why not get into it and work through it, these limiting beliefs and wounds that we carry around. So I think it's fantastic. Now, I'm
Yep,
particularly really interested in
exactly.
you because you have a PhD. What's your PhD in?
It's in counseling psychology
Yeah.
/ organizational psychology. So I grew up in the therapeutic environment, but then quickly got into working with businesses.
Yeah. And I find the latter part interesting because we actually, a lot of our members are guys that actually have solid professions and families and
Sure.
work, are executives. When I started MensGroup, I wasn't sure what kind of guys it would be. If it was guys that were struggling to figure it out and riding the bus, or if it was, and it's turned out to be a lot of hotshot investment bankers and doctors and lawyers and executives. And so I think you bring a really unique perspective to these conversations. You get to be around a lot of high achievers and then your own experiences as well.
Exactly. And I think that that's a really important point because, I find for myself, I've been able to be really successful in the world, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been hard for me in, sort of all other aspects of my life. I've been fortunate in, being driven in the work that I do. I think I'm sort of perfectly aligned for that, but there are lots of other parts of this that don't work very well for me. And I think that there's, you can be successful in life, in your work, but not be successful in your personal life. And they're not the same thing. They're
No,
different.
they're not even close to the same thing.
Totally.
And the more time I've spent with high achievers, the more I've realized their home lives usually aren't that happy.
Exactly.
They usually don't have their internal lives figured out. And that's part of the reason why they are so driven to be successful.
Exactly. And the first half of my life was pretty hard with what I described I grew up with. But the second half, I've had a really wonderful life, but it's still really been hard. There are lots of sort of, it's sort of like I'm dragging this ball and chain around with me. And I got a lot of workarounds. And I've done pretty well at it, but it's still hard for me. And I think I'm just interestingly, after I wrote this book, I decided to really take myself on in a very deep way. And I've gotten deeper into my own therapy and starting to get a better sense of what that trauma is and what some of those core wounds are and attachment sort of problems that I have and what's really up for me. So here I am in my 70s and I'm figuring that out.
That's so fantastic. And I love it because a lot of people think, oh, I don't need to get into this stuff as I get older. They're in middle age or they're approaching retirement or whatever. That stuff's uncomfortable. So I love that you are digging into that. That's fantastic. One question I'd love to ask you is we have a lot of guys out there. They think, well, I don't really have stuff inside me. I don't have trauma to work through. I'm fine. My childhood was fine. What would you say to those guys from being a, psychologist who works with men and high achieving men and has now written a book for men on this exact subject?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think it's true that we all have this sort of unique way that we're brought up in the world. The thing I'm learning about is that there are these core attachments that we have when we're early on in terms of the sort of love and relationship that we have with our caregivers, some of which are challenged, some of which are beautiful. And then there's this next phase when you're up at maybe 4 or 5 years old, when you start to really inform your own sort of ego attachments about what it is to be successful in the world. And then maybe the next piece of the work is where you start to become acculturized in your, through sports or through school, and you start to get some things coming at you that don't really work so well. All of us, in fact, the research shows that about 70% of the men in our society, and this is I'm talking about very successful people included, are at a stage of human development that is more a reactive stage, meaning that it actually is being more sublimated to one's ego. And the ego basically is formulating ideas and sort of beliefs and tendencies and behaviors that are more about preserving and securing and keeping yourself safe, less about actually being really creative and out in the workplace, for example. So all of us experience that no matter what sort of we had early on in our lives. All of us are driven by this ego that wants to satisfy or achieve or be safe, for example.
Sorry, I muted myself because I was actually taking notes there. I can see so much of that in myself as well. And for me, I do see the ego side of it. For me, it just felt like there were these emotions that would come flying out of me. I didn't understand where they came from. It was a disproportionately large reaction for the situation some of the time. And I see a lot of men doing that. And those are the same men that say, no, I don't have anything to work on. You know?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's really the place to look. Like the place to start is to look at your feelings, which many of us really have a challenge even identifying. Like, what is it?
Yeah.
But I'm starting to realize now that when I start to feel anger or frustration, I have to press the pause button and go inside and really start to get in touch with, well, what am I really feeling? Because I think we all grow up with that detachment that we have to our feelings as men, certainly. And it's very uncharted territory for me, I know, and my clients. And so that's really the first piece of the equation is kind of recognizing those feelings and starting to understand what they're really about. Why, because you're doing something with those feelings, which are usually more about anger or fear or running away or isolation. All the things that are the problems that you described earlier on are the things that really are the sort of manifestations of those things inside of us that are ways of trying to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah. And I found that, would you agree? I mean, I don't have any clinical background or PhD, but it seems to me that like we're all carrying around these painful experiences that we didn't necessarily get to express our feelings around the moment. If you're a little kid, you can't get angry back at your parents. It's going to make things worse, right? So we carry around these little painful experiences, and then we're walking through the world and we run into experiences that or situations that remind us of that. That's why we have disproportionately large reactions and kind of blow things up. Would you say that's accurate?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And we can look at those as sort of triggering events, right? So things that trigger you in your environment. Some of, for me, a lot of them are the same type of thing. Like, for example, I get triggered when I go to a dinner party because growing up in my family was very dangerous when we were at dinner. There were lots of things going back and forth. I get sort of traumatized when I'm at a dinner party and I get kind of frozen. So that's a triggering event for me. I'll go sort of isolated and get a little bit withdrawn and feel very uncomfortable. There are a myriad of triggering events that happen. I call them moments of truth, Sean, that are opportunities for you to, it's a moment of truth because you can either go south on it or you can go north on it.
Yeah.
But the first thing you have to do is you have to say, oh, it's happening.
Yeah.
That's the critical first step in actually your journey to sort of resolving some of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, I found that in my own journey. I see a lot of guys in men's group realizing that these emotions, that it's such an awesome opportunity to get into it because they don't expose themselves that often. I'm curious to know from your clinical background, like, do you understand what the mechanism is or why people? I know the why because we're afraid to express them, these kinds of things, but like, what is it that allows us to actually put those things, kind of bury them and not think about them and almost live our lives like they're not even there, Yeah,
it's called the unconscious.
Yeah.
And basically that's what it is. We're not aware of it. So basically all we're aware of is the stuff that's happening on the outside. So it's sort of like there's this whole inner landscape inside of us that's really kind of driving that behavior. And it's sort of like we just have chopped ourselves off, at the head, and we're not even paying any attention to that. So how could you possibly fix anything or be better at something other than just continuing to do the same thing when the same things come up? And that's really the idea of sort of dealing with the behavior at the root cause level. Okay. So a good example of that, Sean, is what I was describing before, is like these triggering events come up. And the question is, I described them as moments of truth. The reason why they're moments of truth is because they're opportunities for you to become aware and actually choose to do something differently. Now, what do you choose to do something differently based on? Well, instead of the feelings that you have in your body, you react based on your values or what you want to be. what you want to be doing. And I would suggest to you that that's really, I mean, if you look at it at the most finite level, just from a behavioral standpoint, that's what the legacy of your life is built on. It's like, if you just think about hundreds of those in a month. So now here you are with your kid, who's growing up, and you've got these numerous moments of truth that you've reacted a certain way with. And that person starts to see you that way, or your spouse or your worker.
Right. Yeah.
So that's how your life is built. And if you want to change that, you have to look at the operating system that it is based on.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And so that is really the first half of your book, I'd say, right? Is like
Yes.
getting your arms around who you are, figuring out what's driving the behavior, talking to people about it. Could you talk about that first step of the process, like how guys can actually dig into their stuff?
Yeah. So the first part of it is the story of you. So like, what do you know about yourself? There are really three stories. One of them is the sort of the way you describe yourself in the world. That's your external story. Okay. And then there's the inner story, which would be like, how do you really think about yourself in the, in your own mind? What are your fears? What's the internal dialogue? That's another story, the second one. Yeah. And the third story is really the person who you seek to be. And so really most of the time we have this second story, or maybe we have this aspirational story, but most of the time we're out there hanging out in that first story. It's like, here's who I'm pretending to be.
Yes.
Beating my chest against the wall. I'm trying to, beat everybody and everything I possibly can. It's like, that's the way we live our lives. But those other two stories are really powerful and important, and we never really give them a chance. You have to press the pause button big time to be able to actually get to those. And if you're running around 100 miles an hour in the white water of your day job, unless you do something like you're doing, where you get people in a group and they're actually sort of stopping and saying, okay, what's really happening here? And that's not likely, you're not going to change anything.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it seems like, this is like a bit of a diversion, but it seems like society today is promoting junk food values. Totally. and promoting distraction. It's not promoting stillness and introspection.
Exactly.
All of this kind of stuff. You've observed the same thing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it makes it very difficult, because the only way we can actually be self-aware and be self-reflective is by pressing the pause button. Or I guess you could ask other people for feedback, or you can glean feedback from other people, from who are close to you, who you work with, or who are your significant others. Like, if you're the best way to judge whether you're effective, true effectiveness, is, are you getting good results on a balanced basis? In other words, not only getting high achievement in terms of money or success, but are you balanced in your life? Are you healthy? Are you happy? Do you have effective relationships? So it's only when you have the balance of those two that you really have truly effective. And the way that you know that you're off and not living by true principles is when one of those things is off. Usually for the people we're talking about, it's more the personal side that's off, or their own health, for example. Give you an example. For me, I'm cruising along in my life, and all of a sudden, I get to be, I think I was in my early 60s, and bladder cancer. And I know that came specifically from some stress I had in my work. And I was out for at least a year of my life. And I was lucky that I made it through. But I know that was a big wake-up call for me. And I said, you've really got to look at this, Tony, and start to look at, how you can really shift some things here. Because I was pushing it way too hard.
Yeah. And looking back, would you say that part of the reason why you ended up in that situation with a chronic illness, in this case, bladder cancer, was because you were ignoring those parts of you that had to do with the emotions? Yeah. All that weight you were carrying around. Yeah.
I had stuffed them inside.
Yeah.
And things got really hard. I had some hard things happen in the external world. And all of a sudden it was just a big flood. And guess what? In your body, that trauma and that fear and that all of that negative energy goes to a certain place that's the most fertile for some kind of illness In this case, it was my bladder. And there you have it. It's just sort of like a time bomb waiting to happen, you know?
Yep.
And so for a lot of our listeners, you know, you can think about it, well, you know, for a lot of us, it happens, let's say around our 50s, when we're cruising along really fast, and all of a sudden, you know, something happens, you start having a faulty relationship with your spouse or significant other, with your kids go south, or your work goes south, and all of a sudden there it is, and bam, it hits you right in the face. And now you've got the wake up call. And I call that bringing yourself to the doorstep of change, bringing yourself to the doorstep of change. Like, what's it going to take for you to really look at yourself? Because most of the time, I'm not going to, and you're not going to, because it's too hard. It's the hardest work to do. And I wrote about that in my book. It wasn't the cancer. It wasn't my first divorce. It wasn't living with my mother growing up. It was deciding to take myself on. That was the hardest. And I'm still in that. That's the hardest piece of work.
I would agree. That's the hardest for me as well, because the brain's job is to keep us away from pain. Totally. These are the most painful things we've ever encountered or are holding on to, you know.
Exactly. And we create this sort of scaffolding around our lives that we think is, you know, going to hold us up, but it's really more like a house of cards.
Yeah.
It's going to come down at some point. You know, the question is, are you going to wait for that thing to happen? That we could call that being reactive, or you can be more proactive and say, I'm going to get out ahead of this. Like, I'm going to actually make a decision to improve my lot. Like, I'm going to be a transition person in my life. I'm going to be a better man than the people that sort of were around me. Like, for example, than my father, who really succumbed to my mother. He couldn't win over her. And so he became a smaller man. Am I going to do the same thing, or am I going to actually have a voice? And am I going to actually be a transition person in my life? That's a really tough choice for men.
Yeah, because when you put it in those words, of course, everybody is going to say they want to be the transition or the whatever they want to become. But then the actual act of like, okay, you made the decision, you want to change. And then the very next day, you're facing the same habits, same neural pathways, same tendencies, emotions coming up. It's just like literally the hardest thing in the world, you know? The
hardest thing for me was, to that point, was I think I was maybe in my mid 30s, when I had 2 kids, and I went, you know, I was very unhappy in my marriage. I thought it was my first wife that I was unhappy with. Certainly there were some challenges, but what I realized after going through all of that, when I got into my second marriage, was there I was again. Sort of like that old adage, wherever you go, there you are.
There you are.
And that was maybe one of the scariest moments in my life, because I realized, holy shit, this is the same thing all over again.
Which is beautiful, though, because that's the moment that's
right.
When you see that, it's really hard to not see that. Totally. You know, moving forward.
Totally. Like, I mean, the first time you could blame everything externally, right? But the second time, it's not as much so.
Totally. Yeah. That's what I found as well. Yeah. And I can still keep that scaffolding up for months or years, or even decades, but like eventually I'm going to have to look at that thing.
Yeah. And that's really, I think, you know, in the book, that first half is really sort of putting that mirror up against yourself. But you have to be open to that. I mean, you have to be willing. Like, something has to get you to the point where you're going to actually look at yourself, because most of us are running so fast, and we're getting a lot of external positive feedback, like especially if you're an executive or a high performing leader. I mean, everybody's bowing down to you, and you're doing all these incredible things in the marketplace. You know, so you don't get any feedback. You don't get any feedback.
Not any real feedback.
Yeah. I mean, the only place you're getting feedback, and people say it all the time, well, you know, my spouse knows, you know, she tells me, or, you know, or my best friend maybe might tell you, but maybe not even that. So the biggest problem we have is that we really don't have a good mirror for ourselves. That's a real problem, Sean. I mean, I think that's a real problem, because we're just making all this stuff up about ourselves and not even close to understanding what the impact we're having on the world. Right?
Yeah, and as a result, like I'm just wondering how you view it in other people, like going through the world now with the work that I've done, 10 years of digging into this stuff, reflecting the mirror back of myself, therapy, counseling, coaching, you name it, journaling, psychedelics, all sorts of crazy stuff to understand these different parts of myself. And I'm still a mess, and I look at other people and I can spot the lack of self-awareness almost instantly now, or the ego running the show. Have you noticed the same thing?
So we could call that like moving from an unconsciously incompetent, or maybe unconsciously competent, to a consciously, more competent, or not so. So I'm kind of at the same place you are. Like I have more awareness of all of these dynamics and things, but trying to actually put them into motion on a regular basis is very difficult. Now I'm not. I mean, you and I are painting I hope we're not painting a picture of despair here, because look, it is hard work. There's no question about it, but it's the most productive work you can do. Like, what's the alternative? Just kind of keep going and doing what's going on in your life and not really improving. And it's not like we need to improve the whole thing all together. You can take steps and make great improvements. And I've gotten some really lovely feedback from people about some things that I'm doing differently, and I revere in that. It makes me want to do them more, and I'm feeling that more integrity in my life about the things I'm doing because of that. But yeah, it's a journey. It's a journey, and and we're all on that path together. So yeah, that first part of the book is really more about the outer life assessing, and then looking at the inner game that's sort of driving you. And sort of the pivot point, if you want to talk about it, would be sort of how do you turn the corner?
Yeah. That was going to be my next question is, okay,
yeah.
You've decided you want to turn the mirror back at yourself. Quickly, before we go into the part two, I just want to ask one other question that is, besides getting feedback from people around you, your spouse, besides maybe starting to create more stillness in your life, more quiet time to listen to yourself and what's actually going on inside, which I think is one of the tools that I use. What other tools can you recommend to guys who might be wanting to understand what's actually going on with them?
Yeah.
What's causing their suffering? Yeah.
Yeah. So generally I'm going to suggest that there are three sort of pathways. One of them is sort of a behavioral pathway. So a behavioral pathway would be more understanding what those triggers are, making some different choices, sort of like the whole idea of the moments of truth in your operating system. Okay, so self-awareness, choice, accountability, that's just sort of like typical cognitive behavioral approach to change, Sean. Okay, so there's that is a general pathway, and there's some tools in that. Okay, so that's number one.
Yeah, great.
Second pathway, I would say, would be more of a psychodynamic approach to change. And really what we're talking about there is what we talked about before, Sean, which is understanding your core dynamic, your core attachment map, and realizing that there are these themes in your life that are driving your activity and behavior, and starting to look into those, breathe into them, start to try to dissipate some of that energy, to give it less of a life in driving your behavior. So that's more of a sort of psychological approach to changing your path. Okay, so cognitive, behavioral, and I'd say the third one is what you were talking about, which is more of a spiritual path. So, for example, through meditation, through listening to great masters talk about sort of mastering, yourself. Some of the people I study are, some of Paramahansa Yogananda was sort of the yogi that I studied with. He started the Self-Realization Fellowship. I learned how to meditate. I learned how to take more responsibility for my life. There's a whole tool set. Another person in that realm that I really like a lot is Michael Singer, who wrote a book, New York Times bestseller called talk basically about the untethering yourself from your soul.
The untethered soul. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the answer to your question lies in there are tools and ways of thinking about the world and changing yourself in a cognitive sort of behavioral approach, a spiritual approach, and a more psychodynamic approach. Everything else, in my opinion, would be more sort of like a wet finger in the air saying, well, I heard this thing, I think I'll try this. It's sort of like, yeah, I'll try that. It would be sort of like dealing with the symptoms through some more tactical things that I'm not saying they're bad, but they're not really going to get at the sort of core dynamic. And what I'm finding for myself, Sean, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to use all three of those, because I think that it's sort of like the old game of Pac-Man. You got to get more power. So you get more power when you bring more of those into your life. So that's what I'm working on with people. I'm working on with, if they're willing to go a deeper level, I had a friend of mine brilliant person who, was trying to fix everything through a cognitive approach. It wasn't enough. She finally made a decision to go into a more psychodynamic approach. And now she's really having great success. Yeah. So that's what it takes to kind of go. Now, there's one other piece I want to share with you that I think is the transition from the inner to the outer. I don't think you can really change anything unless you learn some skills. So what I call it is developing attributes for the journey. So what are the attributes that you need to develop to be able to sort of be effective in your life? And there are things like self-regulation of yourself. Clearly, very deep listening, things like being able to work effectively in dealing with conflict or disagreements. So there is a bunch of very specific skills that you can develop that will help you to be more present and more authentic and more effective in that space where challenges come up. So your challenges are going to come up in the intersection points of your life, whether it be in your personal relationships or in your work. So developing those skills is really an important piece, I think, of making a shift. Without that kind of knowledge, without that kind of knowledge, you're not really going to get anywhere. Yeah, because these issues are medium to long term. A lot of them, they're not going to be solved overnight. So you need some sort of management skills for them, right? Exactly. Yeah, that's interesting. And so, the second part of the book is really about, okay, once you've reflected the mirror back to you, you're getting your head around who you are and where your baggage may lie, and it's difficult to do that. Second part is like how to transform your operating system, how you think, your emotional responses, doing something about it. So could you talk a little bit more about that part of your journey and how men can think about it? Yep. So part of it is cultivating this very first and most important skill. It's basically around, I call it the awareness quotient. So the most important thing that is going to drive success and change in a man is going to be their ability to be aware of what's happening around them and inside of them. Okay. So that's sort of job one. And when you start to do that, you start to get feedback into the system about what's sort of out of whack. The second thing that needs to happen is you have to be in choice. So being in choice means I'm going to choose to do something differently. And once you make that choice, then I'm suggesting that sort of having what I would call a growth mindset, and that's been written a lot about lately. A growth mindset would be really being open to doing some things differently and learning about different ways of doing things. And so the idea of actually starting to look at those moments of truth as opportunities for change and personal growth, developing, cultivating your values is really what sort of I would call stage 3 after the outer and inner kind of look-see. Yes. Is where you start to kind of work on that operating system. So that's I think that's where I think the rubber hits the road with that sort of awareness and choice, let's call it. There's one other piece of it, if you want to go there next, which is around the accountability piece. But
Yes, great.
sure you're okay with that.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, I was going to mention, I was going to bring up accountability later, so you beat me to the chase.
Okay, so I think accountability is sort of the holy grail of improving ourselves. Because think about it. How many times have you read a book or said, oh, I need to do something differently? This is not working for me. I think we've all kind of done that. And we all come to these, our groups or our work that we're doing or our relationships, and we say, I really need to change and I really want to work on this. And you start to make some goals and you work on some of the things like we're talking about. And all of a sudden you're back in your day job, and it's sort of like the path of least resistance. And you go back to that place where you always were and you felt more comfortable. There's actually a psychological principle that I learned about early on in my studies. It's called the incorporation effect. And the incorporation effect says, when you make change, there's always going to be a reverting back to the norm because you're more comfortable there. And what you have to do is you have to get beyond that place to get to the next level. So think about that as any skill. Like if you're playing a sport, you're going to want to continue doing it the same way you're always doing it. But unless you're in alignment with correct principles, you're not really going to change. You're always going to be sort of just refining the mistakes that you already made. So
yes.
So this idea of sort of accountability says, I am going to hold myself accountable to the changes that I'm describing. Now, one of the best ways to do that is to be public about the changes that you're trying to make. Like, for example, if you're an executive, talking with your team about what you think is challenging in terms of your own leadership, and actually going public with that and saying, here specifically are the things that I'm trying to do differently. I want to be a better listener. I want to be more open to other people's points of views. Now, I started working on accountability with my clients, and when they were going public with their teams, with what they were working on, and then they got feedback a month later about what was working and what was not working. And we asked the question, what could I do to get to, like if I were on a scale of 1 to 5, if I were a 3, what could I do to get to be a 4? What I found was that after about 3 or 4 months, every time they improved, like 100%.
Wow.
And the critical ingredient was holding themselves accountable to a group of people and getting feedback from them and going public with what they were doing. So for example, in a men's group, it could be with your wife, like you could say, okay, here's what I'm going to work on, but it has to be a very specific thing. Like it can't be, I'm going to try to be better about coming home, being more balanced in my life. That's too general. It has to be very specific. What Harville Hendricks, the great relationship therapist, called the microscopic truth of your life. Like what's a microscopic thing that you want to try to do differently? And Sean, I think that's really where change happens. It happens at the most very small, finite level. And when we start to sort of get that repetition and start to see that improvement and hold ourselves accountable, then all of a sudden things start to change.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm so happy you brought up accountability because it's a huge theme in Men's Group. We have accountability specific groups, in our topic specific groups. Guys often volunteer to keep each other accountable, and we see those are the guys that end up having the most success. And it makes sense because, like James Clear Atomic Habits, you see the results of people over time, but really they're just making 1% changes every day. And those either stack up for the better or they stack up against you, So I agree, just little changes.
And one of the best ways to hold ourselves accountable is to try to change small things, go public with it, like the support you're talking about in your men's groups.
Yeah.
And then get feedback.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
And I think that I call that the holy grail of change and development.
Interesting. I just like how you word that. It's very simple, very specific goal. Go public with it. Get feedback.
And then ask that question. The magic question is, what else? What else can I do? What's the next thing? And it's like when you're in that dynamic, then you have a real chance of making some change.
Yeah.
Somebody once told me, because like even with executives or a lot of people I'm sure the groups you're working with, a lot of people I work with, the analogy would be you're an air traffic controller at, let's say, Atlanta Airport. It's like you have 7 planes in your purview, and the next air traffic controller has another 7. How many can you land at the same time? Well, you can only land 1 or 2, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. Same thing is true with your goals. You might have 10 goals. You're more likely to land 0.
Yes.
If you have 5 goals, you might land 1. If you have 3 goals or 2 goals, you're more likely to have a higher probability of actually landing that airplane. So don't try to take the whole ball of wax on. Try to be very, very specific about the changes that you make. My first book was called Change the Way You Change. And it's about making change, and it describes that dynamic of landing airplanes and being, it's kind of a little counterintuitive, Sean, isn't it? It's sort of like, go really small and be very accountable.
Yes. Because these things can feel so big that we're trying to improve or change,
Totally.
big and difficult.
Totally.
And overwhelming, but it's like,
and the whole thing is big, difficult, and overwhelming, but you can't change it.
Yeah.
You can't change the whole thing. You've got to break it down, like any good goal setting kind of thing would be. But I think the good news is that, we can do it. Like, we can do this.
Yeah.
We can do this. We can pick things off, and we can make finite change. I'm really excited about that part. I don't think it's the same as kind of back to what I was talking about the cognitive approach, rational approach to change. I like it a lot. It's not going to be as powerful as looking at more of the root cause stuff. You have to go deeper than that. But if you pair them both together, and even with the spiritual aspect, I think we've got a real shot at, really changing some things. And I'm very excited about that. I'm excited about that for myself. Once I wrote the book, I decided to take it on really seriously. The book came out like 4 months ago. Yeah. And I'm like feverishly trying to apply everything I wrote about in the book, because the book was really just sort of a work in progress for me.
Yeah. It's just a way to share your journey and what you've been through and what you learned, right?
Exactly. But it's kind of like, I have learned a lot, and I have studied a lot, and I've, professionally, it's what I do for a living. So I had a lot at my disposal. I knew a lot of things that didn't work. Yeah. And now we're starting to learn some things that really can work.
Definitely. So we were just talking about accountability, which is really important. And we talked about accessing different tools. What about the people component here? Because when we're talking about accountability, or like get feedback from people, I'd love to hear how important you think it is to surround yourself with people that are on a similar path, focusing on similar things. I've seen a lot of research on it, but as somebody who has a PhD in psychology, I'd love to hear, what you think about that.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Yeah. Here's the story. I think that I love being around people like you who are, really on the path and trying to learn about themselves and have studied.
I fooled you.
And I'm sure a lot of the people who you're associating with, a lot of people I associate with, that's a beautiful thing when we can meet up at that level. Mm-hmm. But the real world doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't.
It's like if you look at your team, look at your executive team, it's like you've got 8 people on it. It's like they are all over the map. And you're not going to control them. You're not going to change them. All you can do is meet them where they are. So life is really, this path is that's why I call it the not so perfect path to a life well lived. It's not perfect. No. And what we have to do is we have to be steadfast in our own commitment to the things that we want to, our own integrity in our life, but we also have to be really understanding that other people are in a different place. Other people have different things that drive them. Other people have different issues that they're dealing with. And we have to be very understanding and very compassionate with other people. It's really hard, I think. I'm judging people all the time.
All the time. Me too.
And I'm starting to realize that, one of my good buddies, I play a lot of golf, and we've got about 20 guys in our golf group, and everybody's got their foibles, and you could kind of make fun of anybody. But, he said to me, these people are like our family. He said, everybody's got their thing, but what, we're just going to kind of be together, and that's all you can really do is kind of like meet people where they are And, and you can help people by being a role model, like by being the best version of yourself.
An example of what you.
Yeah. People, people will gravitate toward that. I had a great teacher. I used to work with Stephen Covey, who wrote the 7 Habits of Highly
Effective People. Great.
Yeah. And Stephen said, look, if you really want to change someone, so you can teach people, you can coach people, but if you really want to help people change, be a role model for people. Model the things that for your kids, model the things that you want to help other people to develop. Be the change. Gandhi used to say, be the change that you want to see in the world. That's the most powerful piece of the equation.
Yeah. Do you ever think about it like, because I'm at a place now where I'm like, when it comes to getting feedback, when it comes to, not to turn this into a counseling session here, but when it comes to getting feedback, or when it comes to discussing the more sensitive or intimate things you're trying to tackle personally, I first kind of naively or immaturely went out into the world and started trying to discuss these things with anybody. And I quickly learned that, I need to actually be a little careful about who I shared with this stuff with, because I could get reactions that could discourage me from doing it. I could get feedback that's not coming from the right place. So I'm not a place where, like, with the important stuff, I actually surround myself with people, or look to people who are on the similar path, but then also being kind and compassionate with everybody else in the world, and just kind of expecting that it's just chaos out there.
Yeah.
Does that sound like a healthy approach?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. In fact, my wife and I talk about it as the inner circle. It's sort of like a circle. It's like you've got this inner circle that's more intimate. It might only be 5. The research shows it might be 5 people.
Yeah. I think that's about it for me. Yeah.
And it's like, that's the group of people that you can be really vulnerable with, right?
Yeah.
Sean? And then maybe there's this next level out that you can start to talk about things. You sort of open them up, tell me what's going on for you. Maybe they'll play or maybe they won't.
Yeah.
So, a friend of mine was telling me, there are 3 levels of conversation. One level of conversation is, I think this ties into what you're saying, is where people talk about things that are happening around them, around the world.
News, weather.
Exactly. Weather. The second level would be where people start actually sharing things about themselves. So, Sean, tell me, how you feeling about this, or how are things going with the wife, or, whatever. The third level is talking about things that are between us, alive between us. That interesting? So, how am I landing on you? How am I feeling in response to my comfortability or my openness to you? That's a different level. And when you talked about the inside group, where there's that kind of vulnerability and sharing and psychological safety, that's very powerful. And all of us need to cultivate that in our lives. I think we all know sort of who those people are. They might be a really good friend. It could be like my son. Actually, my son Tim is now 45 years old, and we talk every day. And I think we have some boundaries in sort of things that we talk about, but it's very, very intimate and very lovely. And then I've got this next group. I was with a good friend of mine yesterday at his mountain house outside of Atlanta, and lovely guy. And he asked me some really important questions about some things he was wrestling with his family, and we had a lovely talk. And I felt like that was sort of the next level out I was describing. That was and we were having dinner with them last night, and he and his wife, and we all 4 of us talked about how that kind of conversation doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
And it's lovely when it does. Not everybody wants to do that.
No.
But you can also, as a leader, and I know you do this, Sean, in your work, I'm sure you do, you can set the tone and pattern for a conversation. And it can be more superficial, or it can be more authentic.
Yes.
That's something that's a real powerful leadership skill that we opportunity, right?
Yeah. And that's as simple as just leading with vulnerability, or leading with
heart.
Whatever it is that you want to get into,
Totally.
leading with a personal sensitive thing, maybe, if that's what you'd like to hear from them.
Totally. It was an interesting story. I was working with this utility in Jacksonville, Florida. It was a municipal utility. It was the #1 rated utility actually in the country at that time.
Great.
And this guy, Walt, was the CEO. He had played tackle for Florida State. He was like 6'7", weighed about 300 pounds.
Big
Beautiful
boy.
guy, very smart, very strong. And I remember running a meeting. They were undergoing some challenge with some other companies from outside of Florida where there was going to be more of an open sort of field on competition. And so they needed to really up their game. And that's why I was working with them. And I remember leading a meeting where all of his executives were in the room, and Walt said, I want you guys to give me feedback. I want to hear how you feel about the way that I'm leading this company. Everybody was stone silent.
Yeah,
and
of course.
Said, no, I really mean it.
Yeah.
And then people started talking, and all of a sudden the whole system opened up. And then people started to do that in their work groups. That's an example of real leadership.
Great.
And you can feel when you know that that's what's really going to open up a system or open up a relationship.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's so powerful. Yeah. I guess the big last question I'd love to get into is to sort of cap off some things that we were talking about earlier, Tony, which is like, this is big. These things to get into are big and difficult and painful and challenging and overwhelming. And you touched on it a little bit, but what would you say makes it worth it? Why is it so important that we, as men, do take on this work and get into these difficult things and commit to that path?
Well, thank you for asking. That actually sort of like was the last chapter of my book.
Oh, really?
Yeah. What's in it for us, I think is the name of the chapter.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I think there are three things, and maybe I'm not sure what the ascension of importance here is, but the three things are: number one, for yourself, that, this is a short life that you live, and being happy, being healthy, having positive relationships is something that, is a beautiful thing when you can, that's however you define a life well lived.
Yeah. Just more enjoying your day to day.
Yeah, exactly.
Feeling less
number
emotionally.
two, exactly. Yeah. Number two would be doing it for your kids, or doing it for your family, or doing it for your community, or doing it for your church, doing it for the people around you. That would be the second piece. And the third piece would be really, if you think about our society, and think about the challenges that we're facing in our society, whether it be the political arena or environmentally or the war in Ukraine, think about how hard it is. I've spent most of my life trying to help systems change. It's very hard for systems to change. But guess what you can do? You can work on yourself. And through that change, you can maybe other people will start to look at doing some things differently, and relationships will change. So I think in reality, those are three very powerful motivators for change. And then the last thing I would say is that one of the best ways that we can utilize this sort of approach is to then teach other people, that we can, through that role modeling and actually doing things like you're doing, where you're actually bringing people together to actually learn from each other.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hoping I can see in some of the work that I'm doing, where people start to come together and actually teach others how to be in this kind of change and in journey to a better path.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and it's important. And I've seen that it's almost selfish, because I actually benefit the most by teaching or by being around, bringing people together for a certain subject matter. It's like I get to learn the most,
Totally.
Yeah, that's great.
They're powerful.
And I can relate to the value of just going on the journey. Like, I feel lighter day to day. I don't find I'm acting out as a emotionally rational. I don't feel the heaviness or the weird. The triggers aren't as intense. Yes, I would also encourage guys to, pick up a book like yours, Tony, and start to go on their own journey. Where can guys find out more about your book, more about you?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the book, The Journeyman Life, The Not So Perfect Path to a Life Well Lived, is, it's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, all the sort of book platforms. Our website is thejourneymanlife.com.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got lots of tools and resources there. We even have some assessments that you can take for the inner and outer life to kind of see where you are. And then we're starting some, groups where we're actually a little bit unlike what you're doing, Sean. These are more sort of like teaching groups.
Great.
We're actually moving people through some sort of skills and tools to actually, I'm not suggesting you don't do that. I'm suggesting
No, most of our
A
format's
little
not
more
like that.
direction.
Yeah, it's different. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's different. Yeah. So a beautiful sort of complement with individual work that one's doing or being in a men's group, and then actually developing some, very specific tools to move yourself forward and sort of give yourself that operating system upgrade we talked about. So
Yeah,
that's what I'm up to. And I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, I can see your passion. I love that you're doing it just to help guys. And anybody who's like, been sitting there listening to this or just thinking about making changes, accessing a guy like Tony, reading his books or some of his groups would be a phenomenal tool. So Tony, I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for the time. And I hope to chat with you again soon.
Thank you, Sean.
All right.
Appreciate it.